Good day, everyone. It's good to connect, and welcome to this CUGH webinar on the Planetary Health Education Framework. My name is Carlos Alberto Fairun Guzman, and I'll be your moderator today. I act as the Associate Director of the Planetary Health Alliance, and as well as I am an Associate Professor of Global Health at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I live and reside here in Costa Rica, where I'm calling from, where I work also as a global health practitioner and educator. We have a great panel to do for you today, and we have great panelists to accompany us with. So I'll briefly introduce them, but I'll let them speak to each other about themselves a little bit when they are ready to speak. So joining us today, we have Dr. Barbara Assel from Trinity Western University in British Columbia, Canada. We also have Dr. Alonso Aguirre from George Mason University. We have Dr. Nicole Redvers from the University of North Dakota, and Dr. Teddy Potter from the University of Minnesota. So what we'll do today, each of the panelists will speak to a portion of what the framework is, and then we'll allow some space for Q&A. Before we start, next slide, please. I'd like to just give you some announcements, and if you're new to CUGH or this is the first time you're engaging with CUGH, I encourage you to visit the CUGH website and learn more about this great organization that connects education institutions that are doing global health around the world. Right now, we have more than 184 institutional partners around 39 countries. Next slide, please. Also to remind you that there is a Road to COP27 Virtual Summit, which will be a climate change and health through three lenses summit. And this is happening October 15th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. and it's free to register. The link is right there. And maybe we can facilitate that link in the chat so you can visit very timely as the IPCC report just came out last week. Next slide. And as a final reminder, we have the in-person or hybrid conference at CUGH 2022 that will be happening in Los Angeles, California, on which you're invited now to submit your breakout panels, your abstract submissions, and your satellite session submissions. The deadlines for each of those are in that slide. So we hope to see all of you there, and hopefully some in-person gathering will happen. We're really hopeful that that will be the case. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we'll be doing a broad overview of the Planetary Health Education Framework. Next slide. I've already introduced some of the authors and collaborators within this framework, but I'd like to also acknowledge that the framework actually involved many other collaborators from different parts of the world and different fields. We had 24 authors, we had around 10 reviewers representing educators, students, ecologists, practitioners, health professionals, conservationists, indigenous scholars, development practitioners, education specialists from different institutions and different ranges of sizes of those institutions. And the process itself took around 2 years, which led to the creation of this framework. If you want to access the full framework, which we will be referring here today, you may want to visit the planetaryhealthalliance.org, and under resources you'll see the education framework, or you might want to visit that framework directly. There you'll see the two resources that we've put out. One is the extensive document, which is around a 35-page document on what the framework is, and then there's a shorter Lancet Planetary Health commentary that was published in April, just before our annual conference. I do want to also just make an announcement that we, the Planetary Health Alliance, we will have also an in-person conference, and the conference for its fifth iteration is coming back to Harvard University, and that will happen when the trees are nice and red and orange during the fall. So expect more announcements to that. It's a great time to visit Boston, and we hope to see all of you there. Next slide. So how do I wanted to briefly overview how we came about creating this framework. We started back in September 2019 in our in-person conference, where we held a interdisciplinary workshop in which we started asking the questions: what does a planetary health practitioner do, act like, value, know? And in that workshop, we had around 35 participants, again, very interdisciplinary, giving their opinions and their intakes on what a planetary health practitioner does. We took those ideas and then we brought together more or less a steering committee or a group of collaborators, that is these 24 group people, in which we met monthly for around 15 months. So it was almost a year and a half period in which we were meeting monthly and trying to come up with what we had found in the literature on what are some frameworks that guide similar education endeavors like One Health and Eco Health and Public Health and Global Health, and trying to combine and create and have some emergence come out from that transdisciplinary group into a new understanding of what is planetary health education. So we did several iterations. We had several breakthrough points in which we had to reflect a lot on our values and what was driving some of the questions that were holding us up. We had to question if we wanted to take more of a depth approach more than a broad approach. We wanted to avoid what we were calling the inch deep, mile wide approach, and we wanted to really just condense and find more breadth. And in April, we launched the framework during our annual meeting. And right now, what we're doing is trying to collect feedback from communities like the CUGH community in what the framework is. And I know I've been speaking a lot about the framework, and I'll just show you in 1 second what that framework is. But I don't want to move ahead without saying that the framework is a product of the context of which it is born, right? We've seen emerging literature in both the Anthropocene and what planetary health is. We've seen many more conversations on how our environment is linked to our health, about the damage that we're creating to the environment and how those things are linked to health. And we're increasingly facing and feeling the consequences of the interconnectedness between the environmental, the social, and the health crises, right? And things like the COVID pandemic are now layered into many other environmental crises. So it really reminds us that in order to be a healthy population, healthy humans, really requires a healthy planet. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And so we wanted to put out a framework that really created a foundational language for planetary health. And this is what we thought could serve as a cornerstone for very diverse education strategies. So what you'll see in the next slide, just hold this one for a second, is that the planetary health education framework is represented by a figure which is 5 domains intertwined in what looks like threads of the rope. So in order to ground the framework in action, each of the domains, each of the threads of the rope will include outcomes and suggested process outcomes and key planetary health themes and concepts. One of the important things we wanted to do is move beyond just talking about thematic areas of interest or providing a prescriptive list of competencies, and really recognize the diverse inquiries that around the world, that through many disciplines, through many lenses, drive and shape planetary health education. That is the why or the effective, right? That why we learn, the what or the representative aspects of education, that is what we are actually trying to understand, and the how and the strategic. So the why, the what, and the how became what we wanted to represent in this framework. It is important to note that the framework in itself is not a stepwise learning process. It's not something that you build up to, oh, now I have built all this and now I'm getting this degree or I'm getting this full list of competencies. Because of that, it does not actually list competencies. It's very different, let's say, to the CUGH competency framework that I've worked on, and some people on this panel as well have worked on. It doesn't list concrete objectives or a list of objectives, and it doesn't also list untrustable professional activities, which we've seen have picked up some popularity in the health sciences. we really wanted to step away from those approaches in order to recognize the dynamic nature of the current societal and environmental challenges that we are embedded in. So recognizing that the learning process, just like knowledge and practice, are not static. And next slide, please. So what we produced after this 2-year process is this, what we call the Planetary Health Education Framework. As you can see, there is this central figure that is these intertwined, say, threads of the rope that consider the 5 foundational domains of what we believe is the essence of planetary health: knowledge, values, and practice. So I'll name them. At the core of it, it's the interconnection within nature. And surrounding that, we have 4 other domains: the Anthropocene and health, movement building and systems change, systems thinking and complexity, and equity and social justice. The division of these domains is somewhat artificial, and we recognize that these are intertwined, and we've kept them artificially separated for didactic purposes, right? We can tease them out one by one, but they will only actually function appropriately for the purposes of planetary health once they're interwoven. And similar to the analogy of a rope, right, the domains are only stronger when they are together. That is, there's the total is larger than the sum of its parts. And the outer rings of the framework are the different conditions, right? The different learning environment, the different local socioeconomic, cultural, environmental conditions, the different local priorities that are informed by what's going on in the globe, and that recognize that these really influence how the learning process happens. And because we wanted to foster empathy through the recognition and the importance of the personal, the cognitive, the social, and really the emotional aspect of the education process, we've put interconnection within nature as the central element. We do really believe as a group that in order for education to be truly transformative, it must be centered in the effective and the caring components of learning. And we believe this is one of the key primary aspects that we put forward as a group. So what will happen now is I'll let the other speakers and panelists talk about each of one of these domains, and then we'll leave space for some Q&A. So Dr. Redverse, please take it from here.
Hi there. Thanks, Carlos, for that great introduction of the important work that we're talking about here today. As noted, my name is Nicole Redverse. I'm a member of the Dene-Nukoy First Nation and currently reside at the University of North Dakota. Next slide, please. So before we get into this question, we have to ask ourselves why it is important to discuss this topic, the interconnection within nature, as part of the Planetary Health Education Framework. And clearly the world has changed. We've went from a circular and natural worldview to a square synthetic worldview. And this lens of how we view the world affects how we create research questions, how background knowledge is retrieved and operationalized, how we build curriculum and implement our teaching methodologies in global health, but also in healthcare widely, and how we consider the hierarchy of priorities in knowledge building processes, as well as the solutions to some of our greatest challenges currently on the planet, such as that of the pollution, biodiversity, climate crisis, and of course the current pandemic. Next slide, please. As we highlight here the interconnection within nature domain, it's important to state that the understanding our role within nature as a species and as individuals is absolutely foundational in planetary health science and practice, as Carlos noted. And yet, despite mounting evidence of our interdependence with the biosphere, our civilization's perspectives and consequential attitudes have not yet evolved accordingly on a practice level. And there's this false sense of separation between humans and nature, which can perpetuate a deceptive culture of domination over nature, inducing many current environmental crises. Next slide, please. As there's been a long history of considering nature interconnection, we see that the IWN domain is clearly centered in a continuation of similar frameworks described in various fields of ecopsychology, environmental education, and related sustainability sciences, including various terminologies such as human nature connectedness, nature connection, connection to nature, or nature relatedness. And there's other terminologies out there in various languages and cultures as well. However, we will see shortly that this can also be applied within various knowledge systems as well. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by the interconnection within nature domain? Specifically in this domain, we refer to interconnection as an indicator for mutualism, reciprocity, and symbiosis. And we use the term very explicitly within to denote that humans are part of and not separate from nature. And we define the word nature as encapsulating Earth and all life, including, of course, humans. And the within terminology has thousands of years of collective history within my Indigenous community. Next slide, please. As George Kajati aptly stated, the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Next slide, please. And we see this conceptualization of mutualism, reciprocity, and symbiosis depicted very clearly by Lucero and Cruz from the Mayan cosmocentric worldview, where there's a clear acknowledgement of the we in our existence comparatively to the I that often currently embodies many approaches of being in the world, which furthers this false separation of us and nature. Next slide, please. From my own Indigenous lived experience and teachings from my elders, we are all a part of an Earth-centered jurisprudence system, which is governed both by nature and also global systems. So there's this idea of a unity of what we call natural or first laws between us. And these first laws embody and basically evolve into how we conceptualize and practice our Indigenous traditional knowledges, which of course inform the applications for planetary health and how we keep healthy as communities and ecosystems widely. And then we have this vision for a healthy future, which is based on our historical experience, but also, of course, our realities around us. And that it's important to create the conditions that enable this overcoming of the dissonance that we've been talking about between being in nature. So this idea that nature surrounds us or we go out into nature, comparatively to being of nature. So the nature that actually embodies us. Next slide, please. So when we think about our relationship within nature, we're really first talking about the relationship with ourselves. And from a planetary health educational standpoint, we wish to foster a new ethos that supports resilient and vibrant socio-ecological systems. And I quote from our education framework, a portion that states in interconnection within nature approach, it really addresses the cognitive, the sense of connection, the affective, this caring component, and the behavioral, a commitment to act. And IWN reaches beyond the simple knowledge transmission of social ecological interactions traditionally offered at educational institutions and hopes to surpass superficial on these short-term attempts to reconnect or spend time in nature when, of course, we are of nature. So it's not just contact with nature, but the nature of the contact that matters most. A deep awareness of belonging to nature may encourage students and professionals to pledge to protect planetary health. So as a human species, we will need everyone to acknowledge the innate interconnection that exists within nature to promote the partnerships needed to create a healthy future for all. Next slide, please. And I lastly share this quote from an Indigenous practitioner in Canada, which embodies this meaning perfectly, to wrap up this topic domain area. And she states land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It is bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land. So if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. So with this, the interconnection within nature domain calls on educators to expand the content of higher education so that it includes Indigenous voices and presence, as well as other non-dualistic cultural, philosophical, spiritual, and scientific traditions that center the integration of humans within nature. So Masi Cho, thank you, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues for the next section of this domain.
Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Alon Swaggy. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. And I was very excited to be part of this framework of this group. I'm a veterinarian by training, so I was very excited that nature is the center of the core. Eric Chivian, Nobel Prize laureate, used to be at Harvard, and a physician, he said once that veterinarians take care of, and humans are a medium to large-sized mammal. So anyway, the way I see it is that this domain on the Anthropocene and health is really connecting to nature in many ways. Next slide, please. And the paradigm that comes not only from conservation medicine and other disciplines, and specifically for planetary health, is that health connects all the species on the planet. And I usually show this slide at the beginning of many of my talks. However, I added one more sentence there to let you not only 20% or less than 20% of our Earth's land is still wild, meaning that we have touched every single corner of the planet in imaginable ways. And you can see that by evidence of how a pandemic can spread globally and how we've been reacting to this pandemic, not proactively. So this is an opportunity to look at our framework and apply it in a very interesting way. Next slide. So it is obvious that impacts have occurred in the over time. You can see here the drivers of habitat change. Back 10,000 years ago, you could see settlement expanding and humans across the planet, slowly increasing domestic animal production, and then increasing crop production as humans settle. But it wasn't until you see a little drop on population around 1400 that related to bubonic plague or plague in Europe that actually caused a decline in population. And from there on, we increased dramatically, geometrically, to now almost close to 8 billion since about, I would say, 1200 or 1800 to be more precise. Next slide. Oh, and then, yeah, that's okay. So we can see that, no, they go next, that's fine. We already reached 9.3 billion. I already told you the information. 9.3 billion by 2020, 30, perhaps. And you can see that ecological footprint of 1 American equals 43 Africans, and that's changing dramatically. For those that are not familiar, you can Google ecological footprint and determine your impact in the planet. I do that exercise in an applied ecology class, and students are surprised that their footprint is 3 to 4 planets. Next slide. And I can show it here. So by continent or by region, you can see the number of Earths needed to maintain the current population size. And this came from a 80-20 vision, just to give you a sense, and probably is not very precise, a sense of our impact to the planet. And most of my courses, all students fall between 3 and 4 planets needed to contain and maintain the way they live, or we live. And interestingly too, I did the exercise pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And then we realized that it drops, but just a little bit. So we're surprised that that impact was not reduced as fast or severe as they thought. Next slide. So this is just globalization. I think globalization has been very good for humanity, but has brought major changes from introducing disease, species, exotic species that's causing massive biodiversity loss. Next slide. And this Stephen and Science published the planetary boundaries. And we have used this quite a bit in the framework of planetary health. You can see that we pass the safe space of humanity in green in many of the areas of concern, from nitrogen, phosphorus, biodiversity, and climate, as you can see. Next slide. And so it leads us to Anthropocene. At the beginning, it was difficult to realize if we should use the term, but Crutzen and Stormer coined the word back in 2000 as a proposed geological epoch in which the dominant force shaping Earth and all the conditions of the planet are related to human activity. So in a way, it made a lot of sense to use the term in trying to express our impact to the planet. We have disrupted massive processes, climate, as just reported by IPCC in the latest report released a week ago or so. And then all these changes are affecting all our ecosystems. And that's what was called the Great Acceleration, a term used for humanity on the impacts starting in the 1950s. Next. Fairly quickly, I can tell you the framework developed by Whitney, probably the first paper on planetary health published in The Lancet, explaining what's planetary health after a meeting that was held with Sam Myers and others. And you can see all the way to planet Earth and the health effects from malnutrition, infectious disease, displacement, mental health, all focus on humans. But as we move from the left to right, we see the underlying drivers on consumption and technology and market shifts. The ecological drivers, all the ones we've been talking now for a while, from climate, biodiversity loss, land use change, and then finally the proximate causes. How can mediating factors, including culture, behavior, technology, philanthropy, wealth, can work to change our governance, to change our culture? And I think that's the mediated factors probably is the key in changing our attitude towards the planet. Next, please. So just to give you examples of the Great Acceleration, we have seen major changes in water use, transportation, fertilizers, primary energy consumption, plastic production, paper production. You see all these geometric increases on consumption. Next one. Some others that have been reported include biosphere degradation, fish capture, CO2, as you know, ocean acidification, and tropical forest loss, all of them in a geometric way, looking at the human impact on natural systems. Next slide. So just to give you an example, I looked at this quote back from 1971, 300 trout are needed to support 1 man for a year. The trout in turn must consume 90,000 frogs, who must consume 27 million grasshoppers that live off 1,000 tons of grass. And so you start multiplying the numbers and you can see the massive consumption needed to maintain a human long-term, let alone 8 billion, right? Next slide. So we went through the selected anthropogenic changes and different multidimensional health impacts, and you saw that diagram I showed you. And so this is a list of anthropogenic changes that we already briefly described, and the health impacts. So we sat down and correlated how those anthropogenic changes are going to change health. Yes, next slide, that's fine. So this domain is trying to understand the impacts to natural ecosystems, how they connect to health. But most importantly, we have to look at the social and ecological approach to health. How can we prevent disease? How can we control outbreaks? And it ranges not only from individuals, but also to populations, right? And that has been the difficult part to do, working from a physician point of view and epidemiologists. We also focus on this domain on the mediating factors of that lens that will lessen the health outcomes. And that means not only health outcomes for humans, but animals. So we discuss all those health outcomes that are discussed in that framework. Next. So the Anthropocene and health has very key concepts and areas of study that we listed in that document. And that includes the social and environmental determinants of health. And we spent some time discussing, okay, those are perfectly developed for human health, but what about other species? So we spent some time digging out what's been done at the determinants of health for animals, plants, other species in general. And interestingly, the term has to be linked to others, like capitalocene, like anthropocentric and ecocentric that was recently described, globalization, demographic transition, epidemiological transition, planetary boundaries, and the ecological footprint. So those are areas that you as a learner in planetary health, you want to strengthen to be moving forward to the next framework or the next domain. Thank you.
Thank you, Alonso. I'll briefly overview this next domain that we think is one of the, again, we're overviewing the key domains that make up the planetary health education framework. And as such, we really wanted to center this systems thinking and complexity as one of the essential elements of the planetary health education framework. Next slide, please. So as we know, the traditional approach and kind of the predominant approach to ongoing challenges really have elicited some simple rule from deductive thinking, kind of binary thinking, dualistic thinking, which is in order to understand and solve a big problem, the problem must be broken down into smaller and manageable pieces. This comes from a flurry of academic sciences, everything from the business to the strategic to even health sciences. We break down our body into smaller systems. We break down economies into small and manageable pieces. And this has really translated into how we design our world, how we design our institutions, how we design our systems. And we've created these systems, institutions, rules of the game in order to, quote unquote, solve problems. And what has happened now is that we are living in silos, right? We are separate from each other and we're incapable of creating convergent, solutions-oriented routes. And we clearly see this. I imagine the majority of people here in this call are engaged in academia. We see this very evidently in our academic higher education institutions, in which disciplines are neatly ordered, social, natural sciences, health sciences, etc. And then we each live in a little kind of hole or silo, and we have this trend in academia to hyper specialize. And that is problematic if we only focus on that. Right? If we only do that, then that becomes problematic, and we kind of get into this puzzle that we are right now. For planetary health, using this systems lens or this complexity informed lens or complexity adaptive systems lens means that it is essential to take a step back, right? Instead of hyper specializing, it is essential to take a step back, look at the whole picture. So because of this, we really recognize that probably the first academic discipline to do this formally, although it was informed by other worldviews, we can speak of indigenous worldviews specifically, to incorporate this system thinking, right? The first academic discipline was likely the ecology. So we do borrow a lot from this system thinking and ecology. So by taking this step back and borrowing these system lenses, what we try to do is analyze, or what the learner, right, will try to do, or what we try to do in planetary health field, is to analyze the interaction between elements within a system more than just describing the parts of the system itself, right? So we try to describe interactions more than parts of systems. And by doing so, we try to examine these interlinkages between human health and environmental health, while considering how these happen at different scales, different geospatial scales and different temporal scales. And at the same time, how these interlinkages respond to characteristics that are traditionally assigned to what we call complex adaptive systems, such as nonlinearity, such as heterogeneous actors, such as emerging characteristics from systems, such as self-organization, and such as feedback loops. These are characteristics or tenets of complex adaptive systems that we try to apply to planetary health science. So in essence, what this requires is a transdisciplinary approach. To understand, right, we need this transdisciplinary approach more than the interdisciplinary, more than a combination of disciplines. We need emergence of new things. And for me, that's the essence of the transdisciplinary, in order to understand how these human health and well-being are emerging, these characteristics are emerging from the complex interaction between natural and social systems. And we use these understandings in order to create solutions. And that is the essence of planetary health. That is what is at the core of the definition of planetary health. It's understanding interlinkages using these lenses in order to create solutions, right? So the other component of systems thinking and complexity is also being really aware of what is the knowledge paradigm that is informing our worldviews and informing our biases and informing our epistemological groundings. We must be able to acknowledge that in order to diversify. Very similar to conversations around race and race theory, we must first acknowledge the context and what is informing our worldviews before we can move on and acknowledge how others relate to the natural environment, the social environment, etc. So this is a key component of the learning process, is that acknowledgement. Next slide, please. And within this, I've been mentioning this throughout the previous slide, we laid out some key concepts and some key areas of study within this domain that we think are really essential. And I mentioned the epistemological diversity and humility. I mentioned transdisciplinarity, the concept of uncertainty and working with uncertainty and making sure that we know that we don't know anything or everything, and that there's some things that we need to plan ahead for that we might not really know at this moment. And that is part of things like tipping points. We are uncertain where some tipping points for some natural systems are, but we have to start building resilient systems to think about those tipping points and how we can quickly be responsive to some changes that will inevitably come if we keep status quo. And I'm speaking directly right now to the IPCC 6, in which these warnings are now closer and closer to becoming real. We must also be very aware of the unintended and unexpected consequences of some of our actions. And this, I know global health and a lot of global health practitioners are very aware of some of these things. This is also part of complexity and how emerging characteristics can come out without actually planning for them, and thinking about scale, including the local, the regional, the global, the micro, the meso, the macro, and the temporal. For us, the temporal scale is also very important because we must think about the future as well. Part of what is included within planetary health science is the thinking of the now, but also the thinking of the future and how those things are related. And we'll get to that in the ethics and equity and social justice domain. So I'll pass it off now to Dr. Assel that will talk to us about the domain of equity and social justice. So please, Barb, take it away.
Thank you, Carlos. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Stolo people in Langley, British Columbia, Canada. I'm a professor at Trinity Western University. I really like this quote from a former Kenyan champion for sustainability, where Wangara Maathai stated about the environment: "We can work together for a better world with people and women of goodwill, those who radiate the intrinsic goodness of humankind. To do so effectively, the world needs a global ethic with values which give meaning to life experiences and, more than religious institutions and dogmas, sustain the non-material dimension of humanity. Mankind's universal value of love, compassion, solidarity, caring, and tolerance should form the basis for this global ethic, which should permeate culture, politics, trade, religion, and philosophy." Next slide. The interconnectedness we have with our planet is central, is critical, and results in environmental and health impacts for all, as previously clearly stated in the previous domains from my colleagues, that we know are not distributed fairly across populations, species, geographies, and generations. A well-known example that we hear often is about our carbon emissions that are very high in upper middle-income countries, high-income countries, resulting in the burden of climate change being disproportionately experienced by structural vulnerable populations. And this can include our Indigenous populations and future generations. So first, expressly, the domain of equity and social justice, which is interconnected with the others, the primary rationale is the importance for the attainment of full vitality, which encompasses the rights of humans and the rights of nature. What is this domain actually? In this domain, we emphasize that in order to realize having an equitable planet for all, which I've mentioned those elements, requires eliminating systemic disparities such as critical power, wealth, opportunity, or health status, so that no population carries this disproportionate avoidable burdens of environmental and health impacts while others thrive. Planetary health also expresses one of the principles that many of you may be familiar from the 2018 Canmore Declaration that occurred in Canada of countering elitism, social dominance, and marginalization. Alongside this notion of promoting planetary health equity, it's very important to look at the various forms of justice, and I'm going to list them here. Distributive justice, so this is a new way for sharing burdens. Compensatory justice, those injured are fairly compensated by those who injure them. Social and procedural justice, which involves ensuring that vulnerable groups have opportunities to engage in decisions about policies that directly affect them. And consideration of multi-species and intergenerational environmental justice and equity, which is ensuring that what we currently are doing now, our actions, we know influence others. And so we must look at how we are protecting the health of future generations. In order to move forward in how this domain and others are operationalized in planetary health education, we must first acknowledge the structural inequities and root causes of planetary health challenges. This includes, and some of the points have already been discussed under the domain of interconnection with nature, as well as Alonso, and nice touch points by Carlos, for example, historical and political injustices, settler colonialism, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, and neoliberalism, which all have contributed in some way to disenfranchising of populations and the degradation of our environment, which prevents what I spoke about at the beginning, planetary vitality. Therefore, for those of us working in the area of planetary health, global health, must commit to imagining bold alternatives and solutions and implementing these practices that address these root causes of injustices with and between societies on our planet. The questions are then, how do we operationalize this domain for us as professionals and our students? How do we ensure that the principles of equity and social justice are applied to planetary health issues and professional practices? And what are then those solutions? We can work alongside our students and other academics and others professionals, assisting them with identifying priorities for action in order to get the attention of their institutions. I often say to my students that are in a variety of areas besides nursing and encompassing healthcare, education, political science, that they're the ones that can bring these particular issues that are producing these various environmental equities to those that have influence and then may impact planetary living conditions. And this is something Teddy will touch on more in the next domain. It is important that we and our students understand that systems of power in order to find those equitable solutions that improve planetary health outcomes, as well as acknowledging our own power, one's own power, our influence, our biases, what resources that we have, and take responsibility for having those to work towards a healthier planet and garnering input from those less privileged in making these decisions. In addition, as articulated by some of my other colleagues, Nicole and others, we can learn from others who have been directly impacted by inequities and injustices to work together and find solutions. Recently has been mentioned in the last couple of weeks, the IPCC document was released. And although they clearly articulate the undeniable urgency, for example, of global warming, which is happening faster than expected and is driving extreme weather on every continent, which is certainly a priority, there are solutions. They can be clearly articulated about what we can do as humans by intentionally reducing our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, resulting in a cooler, sustainable planet for everyone. Again, it is clear that this requires participation by all of us to be accountable and responsible, and that our actions today can impact the future. We too looked at, as a group, some of the important concepts through this particular domain, and they were, as I've already mentioned, equity and inequity, social distributive, intergenerational and multi-species justice, the rights of nature, cultural humility, empathy, privilege, racism and oppression, and accessibility. This leads me to the next domain. Over to you, Teddy.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear the common threads that weave throughout this entire framework. My name is Teddy Potter, and I live, work, and reside on the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. I'm professor in the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota, where it's my greatest honor to be the first director of Planetary Health. Next slide, please. So we've heard some exciting words and beliefs and values and ethics, but those don't make a whole lot of change until we put them into action. So this final domain is about teaching our students how to be movement builders. Next slide, please. Many of you are familiar with the story of Rosa Parks, who was, well, the way the story is told, was very weary after a long day of work. She sat on a bus, took the seats above that were assigned to white people, and was arrested. And that launched the famous bus boycott, which really transformed and launched the civil rights movement in the United States. What we don't learn as students is that she was very, very active in the national advancement for colored people. She was a secretary of her state. She was an organizer from the beginning. They had been talking about bus boycotts for quite some time. And it was a key moment that at the end of a day, she did decide to make that stand and sit in a seat. And later she said, I wasn't tired from work, I was tired from racism. And that's what needed to be addressed. So oftentimes our students think that movements just happen. They just are serendipitous. It's led by one person and it's like a flash mob event. And there could be nothing further from the truth. Movements are very, very intentional. They take a lot of groundwork behind the scenes. And if it's going to be effective, it is laid out in following various principles. And these are the principles that we address in this domain. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a 10,000 overview of what these principles are. That movements need to be inclusive. They cannot be just one group of people. They need to be include as many disciplines as possible. Transdisciplinary movement is very, very effective. So to get our students understanding that if we want to create change, if we want to bring about the great transition in our systems that will actually help us have a thriving planet for our future generations, we need to be working together. And we need to constantly be asking, who is missing from the table? Who is not here? Whose knowledge and awareness and skills and abilities have been marginalized or kept out of the picture? And if students can begin to understand that, we will be building an inclusive movement. Next slide, please. Movements are also extremely strategic. You cannot have members of a movement off running around doing separate things. So you need to have a shared vision of where you're going. You need to have goals that are shared and understood, that there are actions and that there are priorities for those actions. You know which ones to do first, which are more strategic to accomplish before the others, and that you really have a shared, what we call in healthcare, a shared mental map of how you're going to proceed. Again, if you have many, many players, but you do not have a shared map, it can become chaos and anarchy. So we certainly want to have effective movements at this very critical and urgent time and have a strategy. And sometimes it takes time to develop that strategy and land that strategy. And there might be disagreements about which approach is best, but it's worth it to take the time, come to a consensus and an understanding about how we're going to move ahead. Next slide, please. Movements also require effective communication, and there's so many ways to communicate right now, but as we work with some demographic groups, they think that the only way to communicate is via tweet. Well, that might not be the most appropriate way to communicate with all groups. And so to help people understand, to align the communication process with the goals that we're trying to accomplish, with the target audiences we're trying to reach, and to use language that's understandable and relatable to the audiences that we're working with. It doesn't do any good to speak in a language that doesn't resonate, or to use a form of communication that people don't have access to. So students really need to understand this whole idea of communication, especially translating science. How do we take a scientific paper and translate it into a language that's understandable and usable by the general population? Next slide, please. And we need to be involved in transformational partnerships. This is not just collaborating, but it's understanding that everyone has a voice at the table, that we need to free up everybody to verbalize their thoughts, their concerns, their hopes, their desires, so that communication flows both ways. This is not a top-down domination approach to movement building. It's a very, very inclusive process of listening to people and really aiming for, as Carlos mentioned, that middle ground where something that doesn't exist in A and doesn't exist in B is possible when A and B come together. That's the transformation that we need to bring about the great transition. Something new, not a fixing of the old, but something new, and teaching our students how to do that. How do you bring about that through movement building? Next slide, please. So in essence, I know I've gone very fast, just to give you an overview, movement building is absolutely essential for our students to understand. They come in with lots and lots of energy and hopes for a better future, but if they don't know how to build that better future, then it's all for naught. So a big part of this domain is to pull together the other 4 areas and say, now it's time to act, and this is how you act effectively. Part of that is understanding we go slow to move fast. We invest in relationships to be able to tip things quickly into a better direction. Relationships are the key, networks are the key, inclusivity is absolutely essential, strategizing is essential, and together, when we work together to transform our systems, anything is possible. Thank you. Now I turn it back to Carlos.
Thanks, Teddy. That was great. I know we are almost at time, so I want to make sure I leave some space to questions and answers. Just to say that although we are kind of overwhelmed with crisis right now and kind of these crisis feelings, crisis also means opportunity. I just want to be able to state that, and we've been really, really hopeful, and we've actually added hope to our kind of tools of how we face challenges. And we've never been able to connect, communicate, create network, disseminate knowledge as in this moment. Never in history have we been able to do this the way we with the technologies and the means of communication that we have right now. And although we do recognize that sometimes educational reform is much slower than we would want, we are calling in with this education framework for this profound shift in how we hope and how we foresee that educational change can happen in an accelerated manner. So I really want to thank our panelists today, and I want to welcome them to turn on their cameras for the Q&A section. I see some really good questions on the chat. I'll try to get to some of it, and I see a very relevant question here, especially since I imagine most of the people attending are working in global health or in global health education. The question is, how do we maximize exposure of planetary health to students? Is it through incorporating it into courses? Is it modules? Is it degree programs? What do you all think? I think in the context of higher ed, especially undergrad higher ed, how would you go about? I don't know if anyone wants to take this question. Maybe Teddy, I know you've done some work in your university in this regard.
Well, my first answer would be yes. All the approaches you just listed are necessary. When I was appointed director of planetary health, I purposely made the decision to not create just a program that just would apply to some. So we are working very hard to embed planetary health throughout the entire School of Nursing. So every staff member, every faculty member, every student, every alumni, every friend of the school is exposed to planetary health. We call it everybody's everyday work. It is something that every single one of us needs to do. And that is the approach that we're taking.
Does anyone else want to talk about how they incorporate it or what approaches they're taking?
Well, I think, Carlos, one of the important elements of this framework was not to limit, the field, the discipline. The hope is to have all fields considered within this type of educational approach within global health, but also outside of global health. When we're talking about architects, when we're talking about technology, when we're talking about, business. So I think our lens has been very wide from the beginning in this regard, that this is an education for everyone. And, as noted, all of the above from the examples given may apply in any of those given contexts. So I think we need to look as broadly as we possibly can in that regard.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, I mean, some of the questions here, and I'll go ahead and are addressing how do we actually then apply this framework and what are some tools for application. I want to say that that's exactly where we are as a framework team. We are trying to understand how do we operationalize some of the framework. Let's say if you were to teach and try to incorporate something like interconnection within nature, within a university structure, how would you do that, right? What are people doing? What are some good lessons learned? What are they doing in this place? What are approaches that are being taken in, let's say, conservation science to increase empathy of students with the very things they're trying to conserve, right? So we're trying to borrow from different networks of people to try to see what are the best tools to operationalize the framework. The framework is aspirational, as some of you might have noted in your notes in the chat, but we really want to go beyond just the aspirational. We are in a phase as a toolkit team, as a framework team, to actually then provide the tools. We have already some tools available, and you might visit Planetary Health Education, the planetaryhealthalliance.org website and visit our education resources. We already have developed things like the case study, things like a textbook, reflections, links to other websites in which you might find great case studies in order to learn some of the key tenets that we're speaking about today. But we hope that in the next year or two, we'll be able to publish a more robust toolkit. One of the things that is challenging is we do recognize that these teaching and learning, these elements really require to bring in context, right? If you start talking about challenges that are not relevant to learners in a specific part of the world, the learning will happen differently. The learning will not be as effective. So a lot of the contextualization is what we're trying to achieve. How do we effectively contextualize the learning environment, the local priorities, the local context into the learning process? so it's not foreign, and it can be embedded much better in the value systems of those learners and those educators. That is part of the challenge that we're facing right now. Great. I think I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry I could not get to all the questions. If you do have more questions, I'll pop up my email in the chat, and that way you can be in touch. But since we are at the top of the hour, I'll leave it at that. I don't know if there's any closing remarks from our panelists. I think we can give some seconds for that. Any closing remarks? We are exactly at the hour.
Thank you.
No, thank you all. Thank you to the attendees as well. Thank you, Jenna, in the back, and to CUGH for allowing us this space. Nicole, Teddy, Barbara, and Alonso, and all the collaborators of the framework, which are more than 20 people that I won't be able to name. We really appreciate this, and we really appreciate the support from the Planetary Health Alliance in sponsoring this work as well. Have a great morning, evening, and night, wherever you may be, and we hope to connect soon.
Right now.